How's it going, everybody? In this video, we're going to dive into our first technical concept, which is going to be zones. And we need to really dive into zones because it is, if you've ever dealt with the Palo Alto before, or maybe you haven't, and you're like, okay, how do I get started? Zones is going to be one of the first ones, and we'll talk about virtual routers in the following video, and then we'll take a look at interfaces, because it's basically zones, VRs, and interfaces, and then from there, you pretty much get everything else running. So we're going to whiteboard a little bit before we get into any configuration or anything like that, because it'll help you be that much more aware of what's actually going on. We'll pull up the GUI, and we'll actually take a look at what's actually configured. So let's talk about the actual zones real quick, because that's really what needs to be laid out first before we start diving into anything in more detail. So when we talk about zones, the zone in itself is nothing more than a security domain. Okay, so I'm just going to put SEC domain. This allows anyone that has a firewall to basically carve up the firewall into different areas, whether that's going to be the DMZ, or this is the outside of the network, or this is the inside, or anything else, right? It could be whatever name you want to give it is whatever you give it. ASA has a very similar concept when you go inside, outside, and you get what they refer to as the name if. Juniper firewalls use the same concept with trust and untrust and things like that. Where, like on the ASA, you have security levels. You know, high security level to low security level is permitted by default, but low to high is not, unless there's already an existing flow where you explicitly permit traffic. So with the Palo Alto, it's a little bit different. So we have a couple of policies initially. There's no zones initially, okay? So I don't want to get into security policies yet, but the zones themselves you have to create. And then once you create a zone and you give it a type, so there's a bunch of different types, and we'll talk about that. What I want you to understand is the workflow. You know, what do you need to have working? So when we talk about, we have intra-zone, and then we have inter. I'll put in, let's do this instead. Sitting there. We have intra-zone, and then we have inter-zone. Well, what's the difference? Intra-zone means that if I take, for example, E1/2 and E1/3, and I put them in the same zone, they're going to be able to talk to each other without a problem. Intra-zone communication will be permitted out of the gate. That's going to happen because they're basically in the same domain. So it's whatever that zone is named, you're going to name your zones appropriately. You know, DMZ or whatever else, outside, inside, whatever the case might be. So you could name it HR, finance, whatever you'd like. So that gives you a lot of flexibility there. So that's intrazone. Now interzone would be, for example, E1/3 and E1/5, for example. So interzone communication is not permitted by default. Okay, so because it's not permitted by default, you have to do something in your security policies to allow communication from one zone to another. For those of you that are familiar with the Cisco iOS router with zone-based firewall, same concept applies. So in that case here, you would allow to go from traffic within the same zone permitted without a problem, right? And that's a good thing. Traffic within in between two different zones needs to be explicitly permitted. By default, it's denied, which makes sense, right? So beyond that, there's other things that we need to talk about. So let's actually go bust out the command line and dive into those details. Let's go ahead and pull up the command line. So here on the network tab, we have zones, right? So out of the gate, there are no zones created. We have to actually go in and create them and all that good stuff. So let me go ahead and bring this down just a little bit so you guys can see it a little bit better. And stretch this out just a touch. So when we talk about the zone itself, we need to make sure that we understand what its job is to do, right? Its job is to carve up the network to provide segmentation, right? That's its sole purpose in life, is to do that. So when we create a zone, it's actually pretty simple to do, right? So we're going to create a couple of different zones. The first one we're going to create, we're going to add, and actually let me go ahead and bring this off to the side because I forgot that it's going to do that. So we have that. Bring this down just a touch. There we go. So in the zone here, we're going to give it a name. So I'm going to type in outside, right? It's the outside zone, and then we're going to give it a type. We know what kind of zone is it going to be. So we're going to do a layer 3 zone. Now what we can do if we wanted to is we can actually add an interface to the device if we wanted to, this zone if we wanted to, but the interface has to be already up and operational. So right now we don't have any operational interfaces. We haven't gotten to that point yet. Now, if you do the interface config first and you get it up and running, then you can map it later underneath the zone config, or when you're underneath the interface config, you can actually go through and add the zone then. So right now we're not going to add any interfaces to the zone, but we're calling outside a layer 3 zone. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. So we have our first layer 3 zone. I'm going to go ahead and create another zone. It's going to be also a layer 3 zone. And what I'm going to do is up here, I'm going to call this inside, which is going to be connecting towards Win-10-1. I'm going to click on OK here. So we have our first 2 zones, right? We're good to go there. So I'm going to stop here because when we get a little bit further along, in order to do NAT and other things for internet-based capability, this is going to keep it simple, and we can add more zones as we go along. So that's basically how that comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and click on commit, and it's going to take a couple seconds. We're going to go ahead and commit the config, and then we'll be in good shape. So I'm going to pause the video while we go through and get all that stuff working. Alright, our zone config has been committed, so we know we're in good shape there. So now I'm going to go show you how to do this if you're at the interface level and you want to map a zone or create a zone. So I'm going to go to the interfaces, and on Ethernet 1/5 we have, or actually let me do 1/1 because that connects out to the internet. I'm going to click on 1/1, and from here I'm going to go ahead and jump out of the way. On Ethernet 1/1, we're going to come down here for the interface type. We're going to swap that over to be layer 3, and by immediately doing that, we go into the ability of assigning to a configuration IPv4, IPv6, etc. Well, security zone wise, I'm going to hit the drop down box, and there's a couple of zones right here. Well, if there wasn't a zone already here, you can click on here where it says new zone and click here, and you can come in here and create the zone. So we can create outside, it's already there, and then you notice how the type layer 3 is already set. Well, we could come in here and add a zone, add an interface again, or if you don't already have one, you would be able to create the interface and then add the zone later. So if you don't already have the zone created and you're configuring the interface, you can then go ahead and create the zone underneath the interface config. Both will work. So I'm going to go ahead and map this to the outside. And we'll talk about virtual routers in an upcoming video, because I'm going to do that in the next video. But I wanted to show you how you could create a zone from the interface level config. And IP addressing and stuff like that, we'll take care of that stuff in an upcoming video. But that's basically where all this stuff comes into play. So I'm going to click on OK, and now that gets mapped, and if we scroll to the right a little bit, you can see that it's in the security zone of outside. That, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty much everything that I wanted to talk to you guys about in this first technical video about the interface configs. So in the next video, we're going to talk about virtual routers and get them up and running and talk about how they work and go from there. Until next time, guys, thanks so much for stopping by and hanging out with me. If you haven't already done so, please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next video.